began to watch the sky all the time. He would go out at night and watch, and he'd see little stars that would zigzag around and move in different directions. And when that would happen, he would have some sort of mental connection, almost like he felt something inside very familiar. And that went on for quite a period of time. Then something rather unusual happened to him. At one particular point, he'd only been observing these craft for a few months, and some sort of voice came into his head, and it was kind of like someone talking to them, but there was no one around. And he was a little spooked by this. After all, he's only 5 years old, and he really just didn't understand what was going on. Well, this voice came into his head, and there were some associated pictures and images that also came into his head, almost challenging him to answer and try to understand what the pictures were about. Well, he was quite confused and he was a little upset. He didn't know if he should ask his parents about this, talk to his father or whatever, but he chose not to speak to his parents. Instead, he sought the advice of a local priest. A priest's name was Zimmerman. He went to see the priest and explained exactly what had happened, that he had heard these voices in his head and he didn't understand what it was, and he was a little concerned. Well, the priest, oddly enough, calmed Billy down and attempted to explain to him that it was okay, that the voice that was coming to him in his head, he was not crazy, that he was receiving telepathy. And he explained a little bit about how telepathy worked. He explained to Billy that he was somewhat knowledgeable in these things, calmed him down. He also cautioned him not to mention to anyone that he had given him this explanation, citing that the people in his parish there probably wouldn't understand his friendliness towards telepathy. And he explained to Billy that Billy was receiving these transmissions probably from off-world, from human beings on another planet. And he didn't feel too comfortable with that knowledge floating around the village. But it's always been very strange that later on in life, Billy remarked, how did this priest know these things? And why was he drawn to this priest? But he was. Well, in November 1942, not long after that, a rather strange thing happened to Billy. He was walking in the forest nearby in his home. He felt a very strange feeling inside of himself again, and again a voice and some pictures moved into his mind, kind of forced their way in. And suddenly he was able to interpret the pictures, and the voice was very clear, and it asked him to walk to a certain location, which he did. So he followed the advice, walked to where the voice suggested, and waited there a few minutes, and to his surprise, from out of the sky, this silvery object came shooting out of the sky in broad daylight and landed right in front of him in this grassy area. Well, this device, as he called it, looked like a pear. It was not your standard UFO shape. It wasn't a saucer. Billy says it looked like a pear. Out of this pear stepped a man, an elderly man with white hair, and Billy remembers that he had on kind of silvery clothes, looked like a jumpsuit of some type, and motioned for Billy to come inside the ship, which he did. Billy didn't seem hesitant at all. It didn't bother him. It didn't scare him. He felt rather comfortable. He went inside of the ship. The man offered very few explanations, just introduced himself, said his name was Sfath, S-F-A-T-H. Went for a very short ride. The ship just rose up off the planet. Billy noticed on a couple of little sight screens inside of the ship that he was away from the planet. And Sfath explained these sight screens were similar to something we would have in the future called television, and that there were several of them inside of this, and they allowed him, to be able to see things and learn certain information. There was 2 rooms inside of this little pear-shaped ship. Well, just about as quickly as it happened, Billy had been returned down to Earth, and the door opened up, and Billy floated right out on the ground. Even when he entered the ship, he didn't remember stepping in. He seemed to float right in. Sfath let him out, and the ship just disappeared. It was a very quick ride with very few explanations. Well, Billy was walking home, very concerned about all this, was actually not confused, and he really wasn't puzzled. He just didn't know what to make of all this. He was kind of searching for an explanation in his mind. First, he'd been having these weird sort of telepathic transmissions and pictures, and now this pear-shaped ship shoots out of the sky, and he goes for a quick ride. Well, the telepathy continued over the next 2 years. He kept getting these images, and the voices would keep coming to him, and they would be challenging him to answer, which he would try to do, and try to figure out the meaning of the puzzle, you might say, of the pictures and the things that were asked of him. Also, There were many instances when the voice would be teaching him things, open his mind up to new ideas, explaining to him things that were far different than what he was learning from his parents in the beginning in his school years. Well, about 2 years this went on, and suddenly something new happened in his head. He received a telepathic transmission of a different type, something that he had ever had before. It was the same voice, but it came in differently, in a different part of his mind, and the images and so forth were entirely different. It was so different that it kind of spooked him all over again, and again he returned to the priest, to Zimmerman, to see what it was all about. It was at that point that the priest explained to them that there are basically two kinds of telepathy. We're all becoming more aware that we're both physical and a spiritual being. And the priest explained to him that on the physical side, that there's a type of telepathy called primary telepathy, which is primarily short range. And on the spirit side, though, that there's another type of telepathy that he phrased spiritual telepathy. And this type of telepathy could be felt from very long distances far away. He also pointed out to Billy that Billy was very special and that he was able to receive this spiritual type telepathy because he could receive high frequencies that most people on Earth couldn't. Matter of fact, as Billy became older and more developed, he would be one of the very few people who could do this at all. Billy's these new images and these new voices that were coming into his head were an example of this spiritual telepathy that was coming from some alien life form far away. Now Zimmerman, the priest, encouraged him once again to relax, try to answer the voice that was coming in, and figure out the meaning of the symbols. This went on for a period of time, and again he received a telepathic transmission to come out into the forest again, which he did, and again he was greeted by Svath in this parallax ship. Well, this time the trip was a little bit different. He was met by Svath. Svath looked pretty much the same as he did before, the same sort of clothing. The ship was the same type. It was not a round disc. It looked like a pear. And Billy walked towards the ship just as he had done before and felt himself just kind of float right in through the doorway of the ship. The doorway shut behind him, and he was kind of standing there on the floor inside of the ship. Well, the ship took off. Billy was not alarmed at all. Svath led him into the inner room where there were 3 seats, and they sat in 2 of them. He looked on the sight screens that he had seen before. He could see Earth way below them, and already they had moved up way above the Earth. They were 70 kilometers above the Earth. They stayed there for 4 hours, and during that 4-hour time period, Svath began to explain a lot of things to him, that he was born on purpose for a very special mission. Now, he's only 5 years old at this point. 7 years old at this point. Svath is explaining to him that he was born on purpose for a very special mission, and that Svath and others had caused him to be born at that time. And Svath had been even watching over him to make sure that in his younger years that he would actually make it okay, because he had contrived pneumonia at 6 months old and almost died. Svath told him that he actually helped save him from pneumonia and help ensure the mission. That the purpose today was to explain to him what his life would be like and a little bit about his mission, because Billy was going to have to make a decision right there and then if he was to go on with this particular mission. It seems that they didn't want to force it upon him, but of course they'd already caused him to be born. They'd already sent him the telepathic messages without his permission. He had already had 2 years of telepathic feelings, images, and these sight things and pictures that come into his mind. And so now at the age of 7, they were asking him if he would want to continue on in this capacity and if he wanted to learn a lot more. And if he did, that his lifetime would be filled actually with a lot of hardship, a lot of very difficult times because of the role that he'd be taking on. Billy felt very comfortable with this for some reason. Actually, even at that age, he felt like it was a responsibility, something that he needed to do, and he decided to go ahead with it. He also, at the age of 7, was probably kind of fascinated by this man and this ship and all that was going on, and could also probably have seemed rather childlike to him, like, of course, let's play. So at any point, he went on with it. During those 4 hours, Svath explained a lot of other things to him, knowledges about telepathy and meditation and life and what the universe was all about. A lot of things were transmitted to Billy. Towards the end of that, Svath set him down in a chair and put some sort of device on his head. And when he turned the device on, Billy said that suddenly inside of his thoughts, inside of his mind, suddenly most anything that he wanted to know would come to him. He was kind of overcome with a feeling of